Hello, it's Dr. Leslie Ellis, and in this module of Dreams Demystified, we're going to talk about the dream and metaphor. And it is one of my favorite topics because it really opens up such a rich and fun and interesting avenue for looking at dreams and what they could be bringing to us. And there are often dream images that really don't make any sense unless we start to view them metaphorically. And many times we might be dreaming about feelings or abstract situations that really can't be represented directly. So metaphors are often a way to depict things that might be otherwise difficult to portray given the limitations of dreaming consciousness. It seems that we're much more apt to produce experiential images, and they may stand for something in our life, but this is the dream maker's only way of conveying it. So first, let me say something just in general about metaphor, because it is often viewed as a literary device, as something that is like something else, like the flower was like the sun, or his mood was sunny, and these it's for in a lot of people's minds that the only way that metaphor is really used is in our language as a literary device. But really, the authors Lakoff and Johnson had written a groundbreaking book where they look at how metaphors are really much more fundamental to our way of communicating, and really metaphor underlies all of our language. It is a way to represent something abstract in concrete, spatial, or visual terms. So if we wanted to, say, convey the person's mood, then if we can't just sort of have the words in our dreams, we have some visual way to communicate it, then a beautiful sunny day would convey one thing, whereas a dark, stormy night would mean something else. Ernest Hartman, the famous dream researcher, said that dreams are picture metaphors of our predominant emotions. So when we look at the dream images, and especially if they don't seem to make sense, if we consider how is this an image for what are the main things I'm feeling, it can suddenly shed a light on what the dream is trying to say. And metaphors can be simple or they can be very complex. But say, in a situation where it's about a mood, the weather can be stormy, it can change. Something then can occur, like somebody showing up and being friendly, and then the skies can clear and the sun can come out. And these are all often the kinds of things used in literary device to convey, without saying directly, something about the situation. And dreams do the same thing. Probably for different reasons, because writing, they don't want to be so direct. And in dreaming, it's not that dreams are trying to obscure their meaning, but that we have kind of a damped down cognitive system. Our prefrontal cortex is not as online as it is during waking life, but we have more access to our visual, emotional aspects of our brains. And so it is though we're doing our best, we're feeling these feelings, and that our dreaming body is doing its best to convey it in the ways that are available to it. So if you're interested in delving more deeply into the theory about metaphor as a basic means of understanding the world and of expressing ourselves through language, you might want to look up this groundbreaking book, Metaphors We Live By George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. It really changed the way metaphor is viewed. Well, not universally, because some people will still do view metaphor as a simple literary device. But it really is, for people who understand their work, it's changed it and broadened it. The authors argue that all human thought and reasoning stems from an embodied sense of the world that is mediated through metaphor. So it's like the metaphor is the link between how we physically understand the world and then are able to communicate it. and really to understand it through our own experiences. Metaphor permeates our earliest experiences. So we have metaphors that really are universal in human experience, even though we might have different languages and specific words for things. We really do have a map of the same kinds of spatial and emotional relationships. For example, because when we're newborn babies, we really do need the warmth of our mother's body to feel safe and to feel loved, and so affection is a metaphor for the warmth. The warmth is a metaphor for affection, and more is up in that way. That if you fill up a glass, when it's more full, it's higher up. Understanding is grasping, so holding on to something, being able to pick it up. Sad is down, and there are literally thousands of these kinds of metaphorical mappings. In fact, there is really no part of our language that is not shot through with these metaphors that are really mapping something physical onto something abstract as a way to describe it, to make sense of it. The author said that we feel no metaphor can ever be comprehended or even adequately represented independently of its experiential basis. So our language and metaphors are all based on our own physical experiences of the world. And I'd invite you to just, try that out in the language that you use and see, notice all of the spatial relationships that are underlying the way we express different aspects of our world. So we're going to look at how this metaphorical quality of our expression and our understanding of the world applies to dreaming, because it really shows up in a very important way in dreaming and dream work. Jenlin said that the dream does not disguise its meaning through metaphor, but a dream is born metaphorically. And that's because, at least in my understanding of this, and of course there are different ways of viewing it, but I do believe that a lot of what dreaming is an image or a metaphorical expression of our physiology as we're dreaming, that our feelings are represented in these images. And so once we understand that the images in our dreams are ways that our mind can picture those sensations and feelings that we are having as we're sleeping and processing the important and salient events of our day, then the strangeness of the dreams is different. We don't feel them as so nonsensical when we see that there is a purpose to this, and that it is just a different way of viewing what they're expressing, not as literal, but as metaphorical expressions of our embodied states and our most salient situations. And I do offer some examples of dreams and then sort of do a metaphorical explanation or an overlay in chapter 5 in the Clinician's Guide to Dream Therapy. So I don't want to repeat those too much. I do have the Jeep dream here, which is in the book, but I'll probably go on and give you some other examples. So, but in driving dreams, that you can think about playing with the metaphors that might be inherent in that. Like the runaway Jeep dream, you could consider things like, who's driving? What's the road like? Do you know where you're going? And these sort of car trips that, like Hoffman Johnson said, could be metaphors for relationships or metaphors for some other aspects of our lives, although he said often relationships. But then it does matter who's doing the driving. If there's two people in the Jeep, are you the one at the wheel, or are you the passenger? And how is that metaphorical? How is that like your life? You could consider, what's the road like? Is it smooth going? Is it rocky? Is it treacherous? Do you know where you're going? That can mean you can see this is a very interesting and plausible way to look at a journey and see it as a metaphor for a life situation. And then the way that the terrain shows up and the way that the journey goes, some of the odd things about it might then suddenly make sense in light of what your own life experience is. Here's another example of a driving dream, but from a recent session where a woman dreams that she's driving and then suddenly finds herself in a very dark forest, and it goes from being a kind of normal situation to something that's very dark, and it happens suddenly. So she gets out of the car because she wants to go back, and there's a gate behind her now, although the gate wasn't there before. And there's no way to hold the gate open and kind of get in her car. And so she's kind of suspended there, unable to go forward and back. And so you can feel this situation and maybe think about what it could mean in terms of a metaphor, a feeling of being stuck, of suddenly being trapped in a dark place and not really able to feel like you can go forward or back. And there could be an explanation in terms of her life. And I didn't necessarily ask her that. I don't always bring this back to the person's life, because sometimes I think working with the dream image and the feelings in it will be enough, and you don't always need to explicitly map it back to your life, but you can if that's satisfying to you. But I do suggest that she get back into her vehicle, because in the dream, when she gets out of her vehicle, she's no longer a vehicle as a means of moving from one place to another. So when she's no longer in it, then she's stuck. And so it sort of feels like that she's lost her motive force and lost her sense of containment and safety. And so this could map something in her life. And so I suggest, why don't you get back into the vehicle where it's safe? And then once she does that, suddenly there's options that didn't seem to be there before. She can see the light at the end of the road. She can go forward. And I do feel like this is a very accurate depiction of what it's like to work with trauma, and to feel how when you're in a fight or flight response, or in a frightened state, your vision narrows. You can't see around you as much. Your peripheral vision is not as great. And just in general, it doesn't feel like there are options. But the very same situation can look very much different if you feel safe. And it really does change the way you see the world. In fact, they've shown that if you're feeling safe, the faces of the people around you feel friendly, but the very same faces can look threatening if you internally are feeling unsafe, even though nothing outwardly may have changed. So what we can do with these metaphors is we might have some ideas about what this trip through the dark forest is, but really it would be up to the dreamer to make those connections. And so we can play with the ideas, but really it's about what resonates for the dreamer that will make sense of the metaphor, or pull out what parts of this of the images are linked to aspects of their lives. Ernest Hartman, the famous dream theorist, as I mentioned, is one of his main important theories is the central image theory, and he suggested that all dreams have a central image that depicts the most salient or predominant emotion in the dreamer's life, and that's essentially what you might do when you're working with a dream, is look at the particular image and see what kind of feeling, what important feeling is being pictured there. For example, he talks about the tidal wave as being a paradigmatic dream image after an overwhelming trauma. And in the nightmare module, kind of later in the next section of this course, I talk about my daughter's dream of a dismembered woman, a woman who she's cutting into pieces, and she's very disturbed by this. And but when it's viewed as a metaphor, it turns out to be a picture of how profoundly divided she was feeling at that time in her life. She'd moved away from home, and many of the things that were important to her in terms of her sense of self weren't available to her. And so once this very scary, creepy image was viewed as a metaphor, the fear and the horror of the image went away, and it just became a very strong image of what was important, and it kind of gave her some relief, even though the situation didn't change, but just as a way of understanding this phenomenon of feeling divided and realizing how profoundly divided she was feeling. It made sense of some of the things going on in her life. So once the metaphor of a nightmare is mapped and the visual image makes sense in other terms, it loses its terrifying charge. And so it's a very good way to work with nightmares, to see them as metaphors and play with them and be a bit sort of unimpressed with their gory and dramatic nature, but just to see maybe what the meaning is that can be mapped onto them. So I do want to offer up a contrary view, because not all dream workers spend their energy and effort looking at what metaphors are being carried in the dream. David Jenkins wrote a paper called Not Just Another Pretty Metaphor, and he suggests an opposite view. He suggests that we shouldn't always take the dream life and try and translate it into our own, in terms of our own life, but to see the dream life as a real event in and of itself, that we don't bring back to our day world, but take it at face value. And if we do it that way, then it isn't a metaphor at all. It's its own situation, and not mapped onto our life, not metaphorical. And he advocates for viewing dreams about the life of the dream ego in its own right, not always about our own personal life, to at least see how is the dream ego doing, what is their situation, how are they thriving, is there a progression, and to notice that possibly when dream life improves, so do we, but that the dream might not be all about us. And James Hillman and Robert Bosnick are also dream workers, Jungian dream workers, that suggest valuing the dream for its own sake as something other than us, that we get to visit and really appreciate, but isn't completely an aspect of ourselves and our own life. But if you are going to play with the dreams as metaphors, then this is a reformulation is one way that you can do this. It's the idea of changing the dream action or images into generic terms so that the metaphor inherent in the image will be fleshed out. It'll just kind of pop out at you sometimes. This idea comes from several places, but I think probably made most famous by Gail Delaney in her dream interview method. And she gives this example of a woman who's dreaming she's playing with a bunny rabbit, and Gail might ask something like, "What are bunnies? I'm from Mars. I have no idea. What are rabbits?" The woman says they're soft and pliable, boneless, formless. And then you could ask, "Is there anything in your life like that?" And the woman says, "Yes, I am. I need to get some backbone." And in this example, the woman was really not advocating for herself enough and not really taking charge of her life. So the image of the formless, spineless rabbit is a metaphor for how she's behaving, and gives her some information that she may want to think about and make changes around. A metaphor can be found in really just about any aspect of the dream, not just the images. The plot might be a metaphor. So the way that the dream story moves forward might have something to say, a comment about the dreamer's life. For example, if a dreamer's driving a boat and getting pulled toward the rocks by the current, and then lets go of the steering wheel and just lets the boat go, just gives up, then the current carries the boat safely past the danger. This could be considered as a metaphor for someone who needs to relinquish control, or, in controlling too much is actually creating the danger, or something to that effect. And usually when dreamers are invited to look at the dream as some form of metaphor, there's a dawning of understanding of what in their life this might be about, because the dreams we remember usually are very salient and current, and they're about something important. So they once you invite them just to consider, if put this boat image into a generic term, like, so when you're letting go of the steering wheel, meaning you're letting go of control, it seems like then the incident becomes safer, or it seems to take care of itself. Or does that seem like it means anything to you? And you can kind of leave it open-ended, and they will very often have an answer that feels quite important to them. So because metaphor is actually originates in the body and is an expression of how we experience the world that then is turned into images as a way to make sense of and express these experiences. It does make sense when we're working with a dream to go back to the felt sense and really feel into the metaphorical process as it was constructed, sort of back in its roots. And so that this exercise of working metaphorically with dreams is ideally more of an embodied experiential one, and rather than an intellectual one. Although it can be fun to figure it out, that I think that sort of takes away from something of what the essence and the richness of the experience the dream might be bringing. It's not necessary always to put all of this into words and explain it. And sometimes it's possible to feel into the whole of a dream situation as a metaphor for some aspect of the dreamer's life. Like there could be a whole big long dream set in a prison camp, but the dream might be depicting a part of the dreamer's life where they're feeling trapped, and the prison experience is offering a metaphorical movie for that. And that might be obvious, but that doesn't mean that then it's already solved and we understand the dream, because then it's also important to feel into and just understand the way that this particular prison is being presented and shown to the dreamer. Or falling from a great height with a parachute or without a parachute. That can be quite a different metaphorical experience. And so to look at the action in the dream and feel into it and absorb its message and absorb what it's saying without sort of letting it end at, okay, I know what this means, as if that settles it. Although I will say, in contrast that, it can be kind of a fun intellectual game. But I would say yes, and it can detract from the felt impressions that the dream brings. So sometimes just allowing the metaphors to be implied versus belaboring the point of how it connects can feel like it's more getting into the language and intentions of the dreams. So I would always suggest considering metaphor when images are mysterious or gruesome or in some way unbearable, or just don't make any sense in terms of their action or their relationship to the dreamer, to really think about how it might be representative in some way, in some physical way, that's really about something more abstract. And last but not least, I invite you to enjoy this process. It can be one of the most fun parts of dream work, and even when the dreams are metaphors for something difficult, it feels like the metaphor gives a little bit of emotional distance from something that might otherwise be much harder to bear. So they're a gentler and more creative and sometimes beautiful way of working with your dreams. Thank you so much.